And for those of you who really like the deep dive, not only will you want to read Truman's first book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, there's another book that I recommend. It's not a Christian book, but it's sort of, it involves some of the same things. Sort of how did we get to this moment in our culture? And it is written by Benjamin Story and Jenna Silber Story. Both of them are professors at, I forget where they are, I think Purdue or somewhere. But it too sort of shows how we got to this moment in our culture where we have this radical individualism that says not only it sort of denies your responsibility to the culture, to others, but even that you can reinvent yourself. And they basically, in this book, it's called We Are Restless. They trace the philosophical thought of four primary philosophers, Montaigne, Pascal, Rousseau, and then Alexis de Tocqueville. We hear de Tocqueville a lot because he came to the United States, and his observations on Americans were, even then in the early 19th century, he saw Americans as rugged individualists and materialist, and he was very admiring in many ways, but also very stringent in some of his observations. But if you get that book, and it just sort of summarizes the thought of each, and there's some overlap with what Truman says in the first couple of chapters of Strange New World. But if you really want the deep dive, I encourage you to get Why We Are Restless and read it and just see the way that they have, the way that they've traced out the thought that brings us here. I don't think I need to convince you that this is a different moment than we've ever been in. And nobody feels it and knows it more than our students. They can't have quite the sense of history. I mean, you're not old enough to really, when you're 17, you're not old enough to really understand the way things have changed over the past 70 years to the extent that an older person who lived it is. But this summer, I was a camp pastor out at Crossings 1 week, and every year I go, I'm not sure, I don't know why I'm doing this, because, what teenagers want to listen to a 62-year-old man up there, and I'm not getting closer to them in age, I'm getting further. And it's just like, I don't know what I've got to give them. And every year they seem more and more dialed in. And this year, I'm just telling you, it was unlike every previous year. 700 teenagers and their leaders there. And man, what I sensed among them is they're hanging on every word. Those that are already believers are going, tell us how to follow Christ in this environment. We are being challenged every minute of every day, and we're serious about following Jesus, but how do you do it in this? And I mean, they hung on everything I said. And what was really telling to me was when I would talk about my marriage and marriage in general, these kids would go nuts. They would literally they would applaud. Tanya wasn't even out there with me for the first 3 days. I think she showed up on night 4, our morning, the fourth morning. And when she came in and walked up there, we were going to have a Q&A. Just when she walked up there, these kids went crazy, like clapping for my wife, simply because of the way I'd talked about her. And, when you take the fact that, first of all, so many of them come from homes where they don't see Christian marriage modeled. Others are from totally broken homes, and then they're getting and just being assaulted at school. It was just telling to me, and it made me double down. It made me say, okay, Lord, forgive me for thinking I've got nothing to say to them, because the reality is it isn't about me. It's not what I've got. It's the Word of God. And they were so ready to hear it. We had many, many professions of faith that week. because they're also, even those that are unbelievers are seeing the emptiness of what they're being offered. Well, the question is, how do we get there? You know, the Bible gives us a healthy view of self. The Bible does not deny self, and it certainly doesn't say that you should just completely surrender all responsibility to self in sacrifice to the larger culture around you. You know, it's not like, say, communist China during the Cultural Revolution, where it was all about this. The Bible doesn't have that kind of view. There's definitely a view of the concept of self. Psalm chapter 42 and verse 5. Why are you cast down, O my soul? And why are you in turmoil within me? I love that verse because, first of all, you see the self. First of all, we're taught here to basically preach to ourselves. We acknowledge ourselves. We acknowledge the reality of our feelings, but we challenge our feelings. This is so essential that you don't define yourself by your feelings. You challenge your feelings. Why are you downcast, O my soul? Why are you in turmoil within me? Now listen to this. Now you command yourself, hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my salvation and my God. I mean, that's what you do. You preach to yourself to hope in God, that your feelings do not determine who you are. So when we talk about self, we're speaking of our self-consciousness. But this, for the Christian, means, what is my purpose in life? What constitutes a life well lived? How do I understand myself in relation to others and to the world around me? And so last week we talked about Charles Taylor's argument that there is an inward focus on our psychological life to determine who we are. So Charles Taylor sort of argues the opposite of the psalmist. He says, I will look at my soul and see what it feels, and therefore that is what I will be. And it's a very different thing than, why are you downcast, O my soul? Hope in the Lord. You know, we're to preach to our souls. Charles Taylor says that an inward focus determines who we are, and the notion that we are provided with some kind of a external moral source is completely foreign, that our only moral source is internal, and in essence, our feelings and intuitions are relied on to determine who we are and what the purpose of our lives is. And what we see today is this level of authority that we give our inner self has completely changed. And so just to sort of remind you what we're talking about. If 150 years ago, a man walks into a doctor's office and says, I am a woman trapped in a man's body, that would be to a doctor just, there would only be one course of action. And he would say, okay, your problem is with your mind, and we need to get your mind in line with your body. Fast forward to today, someone walks into a doctor's office and says, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body. Then the doctor may very well say, okay, well, we need to get your body in line with your mind. Now, I do want to say that even this has its limits. Think about anorexia. If a girl walks into a doctor's office and let's say that this girl is 5'10" and she weighs 90 pounds, and she says to the doctor, I'm just so fat. I'm just fat. I need to do something about it. Now, I think we're still at the place where the doctor would say, okay, your problem is with your mind, not your body. I think the doctor would say, we've got to change your thinking about your body to bring it into reality because you're not fat, and the fact that you're thinking you're fat when you are in fact emaciated is a problem. But frankly, it's going to be hard to maintain that approach when you put feelings on the throne and you say, no, feelings determine who you are. How can you justify that if you feel wrong about your sexuality, that somehow what you feel is the right thing, but you would not say that about your body? I mean, at some point they go, oh, this is detrimental to your health. And yet, here's where we are. The truth is, the gender revolution is a symptom. It's not a cause of these things. This didn't just happen all of a sudden, and it didn't just happen in that area. We give such credence to the inner self that now we say things like, if you disagree with me and my feelings, that we call this an attack, or you're making me not feel safe. And we use all kinds of words of violence. If anybody disagrees with your assertion about your inner self. And so these ideas trickle down through our pop culture. There's an intellectual component that supports this, and we see it on university campuses in the classroom. But then it's on the popular level. I remember the first time I ever heard the phrase "your truth" was on the Oprah Winfrey Show. And Oprah Winfrey started talking about, well, you have to speak your truth, and this is your truth. And it was sort of a way to say you don't have to make any defense of this in the realm of objective reality, because this is your truth, and we all have our truth, and we all speak our truth. Well, what about when our truths collide? What about when our truths are completely contrary to one another? So what we've seen then is an inward turn of morality. It's not just the outside world. And think about this in Christian circles. How many times, honestly, if you look at the history of Christian hymns, there are so many of them that are all about our feelings and not about biblical truth. I can go old, I can go new with that. I can go back to, he walks with me and he talks with me and he tells me I am his own. And we all love that hymn. Makes us feel good. But I'm just asking you, what's the biblical truth there? There's a biblical truth that God's a personal God, but he speaks through his word. He's not meeting us in a garden. And by the way, that was written at a time where it was about the God in nature kind of movement. And again, it's very personal. And you have the same thing with certain modern hymns that are being written. It's about, what God does for me. And it's not a declaration of biblical truth. So it's not just outside the church. And think about how many times preachers stand in the pulpit, or not just even preachers, people say, God told me. Well, God told me that. I can't tell you how many times people sat in my office and defended their sin by telling me God led them to this. God led me to this wonderful person that I'm divorcing my spouse for. Okay, God's not going to do that. That's contrary to his word. That's not God who did that. But this is where we've taken it. So you can't, all I know, and I've heard people say this, all I know is what God is saying to me. Well, the truth is, all you know is what God wrote in his book. And that's what we have to appeal to. This just creeps into our culture all over. Our culture is irrational, but there's a certain logic to how we got there. And only after understanding how the world thinks and the inherent weaknesses in their thinking can we demonstrate the beauty and the excellency of Christianity. So we've got to know the culture to reach the culture. Because frankly, the other thing you ought to sort of watch that's going on now is, as long as all these philosophies of selfhood sort of had a common enemy, they're on each other's side. But and now you're seeing that they're sort of past the realm of having a common enemy, and now they're cannibalizing one another. You think about like Leah Thomas, the swimmer, the transgender swimmer who won the NCAA swimming title, and you just see the clash with classical feminism. And the classical feminist would look at Leah Thomas and say, look, you aren't one of us. You've never had a menstrual cycle. You've never had to deal with issues that women have grown up having to deal with. It's not the same thing. By the way, I saw this week, I forget, Rowdy Gaines' daughter, what's her first name? Brandy? What is it? Riley Gaines has started an organization to defend, that basically says Title IX only applies to biological women. And for this, you think the world is applauding her for standing up for women? No, she's getting hammered. She's absolutely getting hammered because she's not getting on the train, this cultural train of, no, we've got to defend transgender women. And also, I came across a website a week ago of transgender people. It's, again, not in any way a Christian organization, not a conservative organization. The people running this website are all transgender themselves. But they are, and the verb they use all over their website is screaming. We are screaming at parents of transgender children not to medically transition your children in any way. They are against putting hormones in children. They're against any kind of surgery in children because these people have lived this and know that many people change their minds. I mean, the fact that if you let your 9-year-old get like a Mike Tyson face tattoo, can you imagine that? What would you think of a parent that let their 9-year-old get a big face tattoo like Mike Tyson has? You would go, what parent would do that? And yet there are parents of 9-year-olds that are allowing them to medically transition and change their gender. Again, and now, by the way, this has gone on in Britain long enough that I read that there are about 1,000 people in Britain who are now suing the medical system, doctors and hospitals and all, that operated on their children for doing it. So again, to me, there's no question where this goes. The only question is how long it gets there. Now look, here's what we as Christians have to make sure that we do. We can't, when we see all the brokenness that this is causing, we dare not have any sense of self-righteousness or we told you so or any of that. I mean, lives are being destroyed by this stuff, and that ought to break our hearts. And I'll never forget when I was 12 years old, my sister had married a guy that was 14 years older than her, who was a divorced Mormon. It was an independent Baptist preacher's worst nightmare. And I walked in my dad's office the day after my sister eloped, and he was crying. He was sobbing. His hands were over his face. And I saw him sobbing. I said, "Dad, what's wrong?" And he looked at me, and his first words out of his mouth were, "There's no joy in being right." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Everything that I've told your sister will happen is going to happen. And that gives me no pleasure." And I think most parents know that feeling. I mean, we warn our kids, if you do this, it will not go well for you. And they do it. And there's no joy in being right. And I really think that's the right posture, is that we're going to see the events of this because it simply doesn't work. The Bible presents a system of belief and morals that are unchanging, that are not relative. We know what to do. We know why to do it. We know who we are. It's not based on our feelings. It's based on creation. It's based on what God has done and what God has said, and we must rest in that. I wanted to just sort of cover one thing that I didn't get to last week. It's sort of the end of chapter 2. and then I'm going to hit chapter 3 and maybe get into 4 a little bit today. But he talked about romanticism. One of the intellectual developments that gets us here was romanticism. And you see that in art and in literature. You look at like Rembrandt. Rembrandt is trying to convey often biblical truth. Look at Rembrandt's painting of, say, the crucifixion. And you look at the foot of the cross, and Rembrandt put himself there. Like he's there. The painter is there in the crucifixion scene looking up at Jesus. And so you look at that and you go, okay, what's he trying to convey? Well, Rembrandt was conveying biblical truth. He was saying something about redemption and about his own personal need of redemption and his own complicity in the death of Christ. But you come forward to the Romantics, now things are different. It's no longer about some truth that the artist or author is trying to convey. In the realm of ethics, politics, aesthetics, it's the authenticity and the sincerity of the pursuit of inner goals that mattered. And this applied equally to individuals and groups, states, nations, movements. And this is most obvious in the aesthetics of what's called Romanticism, where the notion of eternal models, some Platonic vision of the beauty, like here's the perfect beauty, and anything we make or create is trying to reflect this beauty. And that's the artist, that's what he's trying to convey. That disappears. It's replaced by this passionate belief in spiritual freedom and individual creativity. The painter, the poet, the composer, they don't hold a mirror up to nature, however ideal. They invent. They don't imitate. They create not merely the means, but the goals they pursue. These goals represent the self-expression of the artist's own unique inner vision to set aside the demands of some external voice, whether it be the church, the state, public opinion, family, friends, arbiters of taste. The Romantic movement makes it all about individual experience. And the goal of painting is no longer to convey something. The goal of painting is to express yourself and to provoke a reaction. And the reaction you get is irrelevant. You know, if they hate it, they like it, it's irrelevant, as long as you express yourself, as long as you were true to your inner voice. And this in literature, two guys, when I did my major in English at Michigan State, I studied the Romantics. And you think about Blake and Shelley, and Carl Truman talks about both Blake and Shelley. And in Shelley, especially politics and religion are there to impose restrictions on individual behavior. So if religion and politics restrict your individual freedom and expression, then what should you do? Well, you overthrow them. Here's a quote from Shelley. Religion and morality, as they now stand, compose a practical code of misery and servitude. The genius of human happiness must tear every leaf from the accursed book of God ere man can read the inscription on his heart. How would morality, dressed up in stiff stays and finery, start from her own disgusting image should she look in the mirror of nature? Well, there you have it. It's like, boy, look, we need to destroy this book right now because it's getting written on people's hearts, and that is the problem. Listen to this poem by Blake. I went down to the Garden of Love and saw what I'd never had seen. A chapel was built in the midst where I used to play on the green. And the gates of this chapel were shut, and thou shalt not writ over the door. So I turned to the garden of love that so many sweet flowers bore. And I saw it was filled with graves and tombstones where flowers should be, and priests in black gowns were walking their rounds and binding with briars my joys and desires. Wow. It's not very subtle, is it? And so this becomes, in the 19th century, this is taking root, that the critical thinkers of the age, the artists, the poets, the painters, the public thinkers, they're all saying, okay, politics and religion both are oppressive. They are suppressing our thought. So now we get to chapter 3 in Truman's book, and he calls it Prometheus Unbound. Now remember, Prometheus is chained to a rock in Greek mythology because he has given fire to humanity, and by freeing humanity, by giving them fire, he has angered the gods. The gods say, oh, we're never going to be able to control them now. So Prometheus is chained to this rock that he has to push up the hill for eternity. And this is in a play of Aeschylus. It's actually a trilogy of plays. So Shelley writes a play concerned that is Prometheus Unbound. It's about his release from captivity. Unlike Aeschylus' version, there's no reconciliation between Prometheus and Zeus. Instead, Zeus, or in Shelley's version, Jupiter, is abandoned by his supportive elements and falls from power, and that allows Prometheus to be released. And of course, what Shelley is saying is we've got to get rid of any external moral authority. That's the thing that will free man. And so again, you've got, in Romanticism, this is happening. And then along come two people that Truman wants to talk about specifically. The first one is Karl Marx, and the second, Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, Marx and Nietzsche have had a tremendous impact on culture. It's funny, very, very few people consider themselves Marxist, although there are a lot more of them here in the United States now than there have ever been. My whole life, I've been, South America has been part of my life, and Marxism in South America has been huge. Liberation theology, Marxist political ideology has had a big sway in South America. It really didn't hit here in the United States, largely because of the Cold War. We connected Marxism with communism, Leninism, and they're connected. They're not the same, but they're connected. And so we sort of rejected it out of hand. But here's the thing. In the sort of Marxism can really only happen with a certain amount of prosperity. And so we've had that prosperity that's happened in the last few years that sort of made people start toying with Marxism. Well, how do we handle all the wealth we've got? And what do we do with the fact that some people have got more than we've got? So Marx was a student of a guy named Hegel. We've all heard, the one thing we all know from Hegel is Hegel's dialectic, where he talks about thesis, antithesis, and then synthesis. So you go through life and you've got this thesis that, let's say your thesis is there's a God and he's good. And then you meet someone who says there is no God. Okay, there's your thesis. And then you hear the antithesis, there's no God. And so through thinking through this changes you. And now you don't completely buy the other guy's view, but you change your view. Well, maybe there is a God, but he's really not concerned with us. So if theism, there's a God who's involved with his creation, would be your thesis. The antithesis is there is no God. Well, the synthesis of that would be, well, there's a God, but he's not involved and he doesn't care. That's called deism. Okay. And so Hegel said this is why society has changed. Our modern culture is not like the Greek culture. It's not like the medieval culture. We've gone through this process of thesis and antithesis, synthesis over and over and over, and this is why we evolve. But Marx then took Hegel's idea and he created a material dialectic. For Marx, our reality, our self, was constantly changing based on our environment. And so he said, okay, it's not just ideals that change. It's that the environment we're in changes us. And so the political environment we're in changes us, the material environment we're in, that is the wealth or lack thereof, the amount of food, all these things, that changes us. And therefore, for Marx, everything is political because everything has the effect of changing you and changing society. Now, we've seen this view pretty much adopted. Truman talks, he mentions it sort of offhandedly, say the Boy Scouts. When I was a kid, the Boy Scouts were in no way seen as a political statement, right? I mean, it just weren't political. It was like Boy Scouts were about, be prepared and Scouts honor and becoming an Eagle Scout. Now think about it, what's happened in the last 20 years or so to the Boy Scouts. The very first thing was I remember the Supreme Court case, which they won, defending that they had the right to not allow a gay person to be a troop leader. And they won that case, and then they totally abandoned that victory. They said, okay, we won the case, but we're not going to do that anymore. And now you don't even have to be a boy to be a scout, right? I mean, it's like, okay, we've actually gone at the definition of the thing. And because if indeed society is changed by all these institutions, then the institutions become seen as themselves oppressive. Right? If you've got a group, an organization called the Boy Scouts, and you allow them to have their own rules, if you allow them to make the judgment that homosexuals should not be troop leaders, well then that has the potential of changing people to that view. So therefore we cannot have that. And if we allow them to say, here's a club for only boys and girls aren't allowed, then that in itself has an effect on our culture. Therefore we cannot allow that. And that's the thinking. If indeed every organization is political, then you've got to use whatever means possible to get it to go by your political view. And this is, for Marx, everything's political. Economics are inherently political. Everything is political. Everything exists to perpetuate values and ideas. And so, man, how have we seen this played out? It matters. It's such a big deal who a florist will sell to. Back when Marx was talking about the bourgeoisie, it was about an economic landscape, but now we've just transposed that over to a moral landscape. And the act of who you sell flowers to or who you bake a cake for has become a political statement. And that's new. And by the way, what was Marx's idea? If you cannot transform the society, if you can't get a hold of it, the politics and the economy, then the word he used is revolution. And so with Marx, we have history as the history of oppression. That all these institutions, their purpose is to protect the order for the people who are in power. And so for Marx, you've got to constantly be revolting, that there's always revolution, because you're always having to overcome the people who get power, because once they get power, they won't let go of power, and therefore you have to have a revolution. And nowhere is this more evident than in Marx and Nietzsche, both in their view of religion. Both Marx and Nietzsche want to do away with religion. Marx sees religion as a tool of the elite and a creation of the people. Let me see if I can find, there are a few quotes that I mentioned. Three things in the book on page 58. Truman boils it down to these three things. Marx first regards religion as a human creation with no transcendent status and no necessarily abiding significance. At its most positive, religion fills a psychological need. The pain and suffering that economic alienation causes are alleviated by the false hope of a life of eternal bliss hereafter, where all wrongs are righted and peace and justice prevail. So he said, Marx completely rejects that. He says, religion is just lying to people. It's telling them that, you can live with the injustice here because in the kingdom there's going to be justice. And so but Marx argues that's not benign. That is not helpful to tell people to put up with injustice and suffering here because there's going to be a better life afterward. And so therefore he says that's the most positive thing you can say about religion, is it helps people live with their suffering. But his argument is they shouldn't live with their suffering. They need to overthrow both religion and politics. Second, this not only meets the psychological needs of the workers, but also works in the interest of the bosses and factory owners, because it enables them to bear their present woes and not rise up in rebellion. So Marx says, if religion is used to tell people to suffer gladly, to suffer, that it's not only given to you to believe, but also to suffer for Jesus' sake. If you tell them that, then they just tolerate suffering. And they'll never overthrow the bosses, the people that own it all. And so you need to get rid of religion. Third, this means that the demolition of false hope, the debunking of religion, is vital if the working class is to realize the truly desperate nature of its condition and then take action in this world to rectify the situation. So Marx is all about overthrowing things. Now, you hear a lot these days about critical race theory. I will just tell you, critical race theory is just one more permutation of this Marxist, of critical theory in general. And critical theory basically says you look at any social institution and you analyze it to see how it oppresses, and then you overthrow it. And it's never about making it better. So a Marxist view of the United States, for instance, is not, America has never lived up to its ideals. They wrote a great Constitution and a great Declaration of Independence saying all men are created equal. They've never really lived up to that. We need to work harder to live up to that. Now that to me is a good American response to inequities. It's like, let's do what we've always said we'll do. Let's treat all people as equal, and let's work for justice. Those are good things. Let's make our country better. Marxism says, the system is inherently bad. It's used only to keep people in power and in wealth, and the masses are crushed underneath the weight of its machinery. Therefore, let's totally destroy it. Now, interestingly enough, Marxism doesn't have great ideas about what you replace it with. That's sort of its weakness. Okay, what do you replace it with? And I would just say, where's the one country in the world we can point to and say, oh, there, Marxism worked there. Where is that country? It does not exist. It has not worked. Tell you sort of a personal story. I mean, not personal, but it's something I have personal knowledge of that maybe you don't. Just because I follow Brazilian politics. 1964, there was, to keep Brazil from turning communist, the military took over. You had a military coup. The military feared that the country was going to become communist, and so they took over. And for 20 years, the military ruled Brazil. There were certainly plenty of injustices done under the military. I would argue, look, prior to the military taking over, there were lots of injustices done prior to it too. But in 1984, the military said, okay, we think Brazil is not going to go into communism now. We think we've protected it from communism. We think it needs to be a democracy. And the military planned to lay down the reins of power and have a democracy. And Brazil elected its first president in 20 years, who died like a month after being elected. Sort of like Pope John Paul I, 30 days in office and he died. The vice president then became the president. He was named Fernando Henrique. I think Fernando Henrique Cardoso, I think. I read his autobiography. It's called The Accidental President. And he had been a part of what was called the Marxist Seminar. There was a bunch of Brazilians. He got kicked out of Brazil during the military coup, and he was in exile in Argentina. And a bunch of Brazilian Marxists were in exile in Argentina during the military coup, and they had what was called the Marxist Seminar, and they had all these plans for how they were what they would do in Brazil if they ever came into power. Well, now Fernando Henrique is in power. One of the main guys in the Marxist Seminar is the president of Brazil, and Brazil at that point has 1,000% annual inflation. Now, you can't even imagine that, can you? 1,000% annual inflation. That means if you have $1,000 today, by the end of the year, it's worth $1. Now, no economy can survive that. What does a Marxist do with 1,000% inflation? You know what that Marxist did? He became a capitalist. And Fernando Henrique changed the whole economy of Brazil. He put them on he changed their unit of money from what was called the Cruzeiro to the Real, the word real. It literally is the word real, like this money is real, and that's the word, Real. And that has ever since been, and it is a stable economy because he set it up on capitalist principles. And I just point to that. And what's funny, Brazil's going through an election right now, and Lula, who is a socialist, is running against Bolsonaro, who's very much like Trump, all his pros and cons. And Bolsonaro is very much a capitalist. He's very crude, lots of negatives about him. But these two, Lula, the old socialist wanting back in power, running against Bolsonaro, and that's happening, the election is in October. It's fascinating to watch. But the economy that Fernando Henrique built is a very capitalist economy. Brazil has a free market. Their money is traded on the international exchange, and it's a capitalist country. But when Lula and then his handpicked successor Dilma were in power, they just, of course, put it on more socialist practices, the government paying a lot of stuff. And the economy went way, way down because they run, even as Margaret Thatcher says, eventually you run out of someone else's money to spend. But to the degree that Brazil has become capitalist since 1984, they've thrived. I mean, when I was a kid, there was no middle class in Brazil. It did not exist. You had extremely wealthy people and extremely poor people and nobody in between. And today, the middle class, if you go to Disney World, you will stand in line behind hundreds of Brazilians. I mean, Disney World has become like the number one vacation destination for Brazilians. In the 1960s and 70s, no Brazilians were coming to America for vacation, except the fabulously wealthy. Now people can afford it. And it's changed. So my point here is that Marxism is great at critiquing, and this is true of any critical theory. It's great at critiquing and talking about tearing down, but it's terrible about building up. And they're not always wrong in their analysis that there are problems. This is what you got to understand. When Marxism talked about alienation, the worker's alienation from his product, that's a real thing. A guy spends his whole life building chairs and he never gets one. It's got to feel lousy, the worker alienated from his product. I mean, if you spend your whole life on the assembly line in Toyota, but they say you're not allowed to buy one, you're not allowed to have one, that would be disheartening. Alienation is a real problem. Marxist solution to alienation is terrible. So you've got to understand that Marxism and critical theory that comes out of Marxism are great at diagnosing problems, and their solution is always just destroy the structures around it, but they really don't have anything to put in its place. And you're seeing that now down in everyday life. Marx sees religion as a tool of the elite and a creation of the people. Nietzsche comes along, Friedrich Nietzsche, he simply shows how the Enlightenment destroyed the need for God. And so he says, let's finish the job. And Nietzsche was the first one to come along and say, God is dead. He's dead because we killed him. And you remember, how many of you remember the Time magazine cover? God is dead. Okay, now that black cover, I think, I'm going to say late 60s, early 70s, God is dead. But it was about the liberation theologians that had followed Marxism and Nietzscheism. And they proclaimed God is dead. God is dead because we killed him. And so once you see these political ideas start getting into the so-called church, you see how it affects us. So Nietzsche says, in killing God, we necessarily have to take his place. Without God, there is no ideal for morality. There is no standard. Now think about it. If there is no God, then humans are not created in some mythical image of God. So who cares about male and female created in the image of God if there's no God? So following Marx, it's putting the opinions of one group onto another. So he says, you've got to do whatever works for you. Create yourself. Don't be subject to someone else. And this is where, remember in the book he talks about, he uses sort of an analogy. There's some place over in Asia where Buddha once was, but after Buddha is dead, they could still show you the shadow of Buddha on the wall. And Nietzsche says that's what's left. He says, God is dead, but his shadow is still there. We've got to get rid of the shadow. That religion is the shadow of this God that has been imposed on culture. We got to get rid of it. So Nietzsche denied that life had any true purpose. It was the enjoyment of the moment, and that was the hallmark of life. If there's no God, there's no standard for life. We simply live for the now. And then there was one third person that he talks about in this chapter that I thought his choice of three individuals to talk about in this chapter were really good. You had Marx, you had Nietzsche, and then you had Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde only wrote one novel. He wrote a bunch of plays, like The Importance of Being Earnest. And he was a raconteur. He was very, very funny, very, very stylish. He dressed differently than people. He was famously homosexual, and he was convicted of that in a Victorian England that had outlawed homosexuality, and he actually went to prison. And in so doing, he becomes a martyr for the movement of both individualism, radical selfhood, and also homosexuality. The book that he wrote was Portrait of Dorian Gray, which is a brilliant novel. I mean, Oscar Wilde is incredibly brilliant. But Oscar Wilde becomes such a hero. One of his biographers, Modris Ecksteins, says, the sexual rebel, particularly the homosexual, became a central figure in the imagery of revolt, especially after the ignominious treatment of Oscar Wilde received at the hands of the establishment. Nietzsche's impulse is found specifically in three ways in the life of Oscar Wilde. First, the artist is the greatest exemplar of how life should be lived, because the artist creates and performs. And he doesn't simply conform to the crowd or to the morality of the herd. He does his own thing. And even Oscar Wilde said, most people, I quote here, most people are other people. Their thoughts are someone else's opinions, their lives a mimicry, their passions a quotation. Well, there you have it. Oscar Wilde says, you be you. Now, how many times do you hear that these days? You do you. You be you. And don't mimic someone else. Don't learn from someone else. So that's Nietzsche's view, sort of takes incarnation, if you will, in Oscar Wilde in that way. And Oscar Wilde's revolt against the age, that the spirit of the Victorian age has become the spirit of our modern age. The second Nietzschean element found in Oscar Wilde is the notion that art should be detached from any kind of moral code. In the preface to the picture of Dorian Gray, he makes this observation: there's no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. Books are well written or badly written. That is all. Now, you remember what the picture of Dorian Gray is about? It's about this guy that can do anything he wants to do, no matter how heinous. He can hurt people, whatever. He doesn't age. He doesn't change. There are no consequences of his actions shown on him physically, because up in the attic, there's this portrait of him that is taking all of the consequences of his actions, and it ages, and it looks awful, and it shows his sin, but he doesn't. Well, it's a lovely fable. We just know it doesn't work. I mean, you want to go with me to just about any soup kitchen in America and see the effects of people living really hard lives. I can tell you there's no picture of Dorian Gray in the attic. It's your body, and your body keeps score. And it's nice to think that you can get away from that. But again, this is why I say I know ultimately this doesn't work, because you cannot divorce yourself from reality ultimately. Wilde said, I wrote this book entirely for my own pleasure, and it gave me very great pleasure to write it. Whether it becomes popular or not is a matter of absolute indifference to me. A true artist takes no notice whatever of the public. The public are to him non-existent. Now, by the way, I don't believe him for a minute. Don't believe him for a minute. Every artist wants their work to sell. Nobody takes pride in being, a broken, starving artist. A writer nobody reads. No one goes, well, I enjoyed writing that book. Even if no publisher would publish it and nobody else likes it, hey, I liked it. People are sad that nobody read their work. People are sad if their work has no impact. So I don't even buy it. But again, that's what they say. And that leads to the third Nietzschean element in Oscar Wilde, is that ethics is really aesthetics. Ethics is simply a matter of taste. Wilde writes, a man cannot always be estimated by what he does. Now listen to this. He may keep the law and yet be worthless. He may break the law and yet be fine. He may be bad without ever doing anything bad. He may commit a sin against society and yet realize through that sin his true perfection. Now, you see that? Your actions have no intrinsic moral value. He just totally divorces any notion of an objective standard of right and wrong. And by the way, you've got to ask, okay, well, who's judging when he reaches his level of true perfection? He sins against society. I mean, there's no acknowledgement that some sin against society can actually hurt people. And he just simply doesn't deal with that. So what makes these actions moral in this world is the freedom with which they're performed. Now, you know, we see this in the way people dress now, and body piercings. And again, I'm not saying any of these things are wrong. My point is that they're happening in droves. They're happening in groups, all in the name of being individualist. We're looking alike. You want to be an individualist? Put on a polyester suit from the 1970s and wear a really fat tie with a big knot. Then you'll be an individualist. Because ain't nobody looking like that today. But, you know, getting certain tattoos or piercings or wearing black and halters and all that, you know, that's, a lot of people are doing that. So this is how it always consumes itself, is that you get all these individuals doing the same thing. Sooner or later, somebody realizes we're not individualists. And it becomes, I mean, you think about it, today what I call the screaming left have become the new Pharisees. And what did the Pharisees do? They pointed out people's sins and they called everybody to judgment and let's stone them, right? Let's stone them. And this is what the left is doing. Oh, J.K. Rowling is a TERF. They've actually come up with names for it. What is the TERF stands for? Somebody help me out. What is it? I'm a deaf guy up here. I'm not, the RF is radical feminist, and it's trans, excluding, thank you. I shouldn't ask questions of the audience with one ear. Just shouldn't do it. I never learned my lesson. Trans excluding radical feminist. Okay, remember not too long ago when the left applauded radical feminist? Somebody was a radical feminist, that was a good thing? And now, oh, you're a radical feminist who stands up for the right of women, biological women, but you say, hey, these men who grew up men and became women, they didn't have my same experience. They didn't have the same degree of oppression that I had. They've never had a menstrual cycle. They've never had men at work come on to them and put them in a hostile workplace. They've not had the same experience. I don't acknowledge them as a person who should get a woman's job. And basically that's what J.K. Rowling said. Well, now, man, she's out. Let's call it, the Pharisees are calling her to be stoned. As I said last week, try and find a review of the last Harry Potter movie that was about two gay wizards. Try and find any review that does not talk about her views on transgenderism. They have to put it in there. Well, I'm going to say this about this movie, even though J.K. Rowling has not gotten on with the program. Martina Navratilova, the list is going on and on. And I don't know Riley Gaines' personal views on faith or anything. I don't know if she's a Christian or not. But to me, the classic, that picture of her standing on the platform beside the transgender swimmer is just classic. I mean, the look on her face. And she was robbed of a title because she was beaten by someone that had an unfair competitive advantage. It's just that simple. And the fact that the left wants to deny that, the extreme left, not all the left, but the extreme left wants to deny that, it's just stunning. But again, we just deny reality. You're living your truth. And this takes him into the next chapter about cultural imagination and the plastic world. The world is raw material to be shaped by the human will. And again, for the first time in history, we sort of have the tools to do some of this. We have mobility. You don't like where you are, you go somewhere else. You don't like who you are, you can get injected with hormones, you can undergo radical surgery, you can change who you are. And by the way, if you really don't want to go surgically, there's an app where you can just take a picture of yourself and it will put a filter on it and give you pixie ears, smooth out your features, get rid of the dots and all that stuff, so you can see yourself the way you want to see yourself on your phone. It's just our whole culture. Just we're all about recreating ourselves in ways that aren't really traditionally the helpful ways. Technology focuses on the individual, on individual satisfaction. Think of the shift from vinyl to digital. Think about it. You used to have to go, buy a record. You didn't get to change the order of the songs on that record, right? And by the way, I had albums that I only listened to one side. And I'll hear this song and they'll say, oh, that's from such and such album. I'm like, no, it's not. I had that album. I've never heard this. Oh, it was on side B. I never listened to side B, because you put the albums only on, or one finished and then the other one kicked down on it. But now with digital, we can drag them and drop them, put them in any order we want. We can even mix it ourselves in certain ways. And it's catered to the individual. It's no longer about an album, it's the single. You listen in the order you choose. You can put in, Spotify listens to what you like. Oh, you like a heavy metal guitar lead. Okay, then that's what we're going to play for you. They've got these algorithms that bring up what you like. Well, our identity is being formed internally rather than externally. And religion, family, nation, these things have become almost insignificant, and it's about the individual. And by the way, churches that don't talk about this, that don't get this, are losing their youth. Because let me tell you, they're getting this stuff at least 5 days a week at school. A friend of mine, his wife teaches in Jefferson County Public Schools, and he said she has to take 24 diversity trainings, and I know what at least half of them are. Some of them we would have no issue with. Some of them we need to be sensitive to certain diversities, but some of them are promoting an agenda. I'll close with this. I've told this before, but a friend of mine was a vice president at, I'll not name the company, but big company in Cincinnati. Has an awful lot of products that you use in your home. And he, vice president, he's African American. Can you imagine how sharp he had to be growing up, and the time he grew up in, come up to make it all the way up to being a vice president in this multinational company? And really sharp guy, and a committed Christian. And, he goes to all the diversity training stuff they ask him to go to. He believes in treating people with respect and kindness. One day he comes in and there is a gay pride flag on his desk. Okay, this is on his desk, and he took it down. Next thing you know, Vice President of HR is there saying to him, hey, we noticed you took down the flag, gay pride flag off your desk. He said, yes, I did. And they said, well, we'd like you to put it back up. He said, I can't do that. He said, now look, I believe in being kind. I believe in giving everybody a positive workspace. I have no problem with that. If you have a problem with my treatment of someone, please let me know, because I want to treat everybody with dignity and respect. But by putting that on my desk, you're asking me to celebrate something which I, in my personal view, cannot celebrate. I can be kind to anybody. I can work with anybody. But you're asking me to celebrate something I cannot celebrate. And I won't do that. And they said to him, well, we can't fire you for that. But you've gone as high as you're going to go. There'll be meetings now that you will not be invited to come to. In essence, they told him, they used, quote, the Godfather, you're dead to me. And his career there was done. And he took retirement soon after that because he realized he was out. See, it was not about any behavior of his. It was about what he thought. And that is the new reality we're in. And man, especially those of you who work in state government, those of you who work in big companies, this is something you're going to face on a continual basis. And it's going to require careful, thoughtful, prayerful determination. How do we respond in a way that is always kind, but is always true to biblical truth and values? And we'll pick up there next week.